All right. Thank you very much for coming to join me today. I need to start out with some propaganda. Don't forget to support NETIV.net if you would. Besides myself on there are three great rabbis. There's Rod, who's teaching. There are lots of good teachings on there. And if you go to YouTube or you go to Facebook, you'll find some of our articles there. But again, if you put in YouTube, you put NETIV as a favorite, you can go directly there and see all of the articles that are listed. Or you can go to Facebook and see the very same thing. So all the broadcasts are there if you want to go back through them. I know I've been looking for the last couple of weeks. The books of Daniel that I'm starting in weren't there. I don't know what happened to them, but they're just now starting to show up. So anyway, maybe they got that straightened out. But I just wanted to remind everybody, tune in. You'll find a lot of great things on there. So, okay, so let's go back to the last chapter for a little bit, back to 69 or back to 6. And I want you to go to verse 29. Okay. Now, chapter 6 really dealt with Belshazzar. Belshazzar was having a party. And the reason he felt comfortable having this party was the fact that they had supposedly just defeated the Persian army and had pushed them back. And so they were celebrating over that. But besides that celebration, he also could count the number of years. Now, according to the story, Belshazzar was just starting his third year, which would have been the 70th year of the kingdom of Babylon. The prophecy from Jeremiah says that 70 years and then they'll go home. And Belshazzar had no intention of ending their stay in Babylon. So he believed at that point in time that Israel would be either left there or punished, and it was neither one of them was his fault. So he began to celebrate with the goblets and the ornaments and from the temple. So we know what happened at the end of that. So Darius comes in and begins to reign. After Darius lasts less than a year, we're still at the end of the 70th year. That's when Cyrus the Persian comes to the throne. Cyrus had, according to the legends, had poisoned his father-in-law in order to take over the kingdom. And so we are now reaching that point. Daniel, on the other hand, according to other Midrashic writings, Daniel was the one who pointed to Cyrus and say, "You're the one." And he pointed to Isaiah chapter 45. And in Isaiah chapter 45, Cyrus the Persian finds out that he was the anointed one. God had anointed him. And it goes through several scriptures that deal with that very same thing. And it's at the end of that that he calls out that Israel may go home. That's the point. That's the end of the 70th year. Now, what we're going to go back today is we're going to go back in time. There's nothing chronological. I shouldn't say there's nothing. Very seldom are the scriptures seen as being in chronological order. They're in various orders, depending on how and what God wants to get across. Here in the 7th chapter, we're now going to begin to read what Daniel has written. Up until this point, through chapter 6, everything was written by the sages. They took the notes of Daniel, if there were notes, or the legends or the stories, and they composed the first 6 chapters. First chapter they composed was in Hebrew because Daniel was still living in Jerusalem. Chapter 2 begins his stay in Babylon, and it goes to Aramaic. And Aramaic is becoming the language by which the Jews were going to be living. So from chapter 2 through chapter 6, we're looking at the language as Aramaic. Now here in chapter 7, we look at the first verse. It begins by saying, in the first year of Belshazzar. Now remember, he died in his third year, so this is going back in time. So in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylonia, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his head upon his bed. And he then wrote down the dream and he told the major parts. Now, that first verse is written again in the third person. So Daniel didn't write that. If you begin to look at the second verse, it now says Daniel began to explain. Now we're in first person. Daniel is actually the one speaking these words. That's what's going on. But that very first verse was written by the sages. It was written in Aramaic. Verse 2 is now in Hebrew. We're moving from language to language. And so as he begins his story, we're beginning to go back to the Babylonian or to the Hebrew language. But I want to go back for a second, because those who have collected my notes know that I sent out untold number of pages of things that I've run through my head. And it all began in that very first verse, which just seems innocuous, but I want you to look at it again. It says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylonia. That's understandable. But what comes next is not so understandable. It says, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his head upon his bed. I asked myself, and maybe you've already gone through this, what is a dream biblically, and what is a vision? What's the difference between the two? Because it seems like, if I'm looking at this correctly, when he talks about the vision, they're in his head also. The dream is in my head, and now a vision is in my head. So what's the difference between one and the other? That becomes the question I find myself asking. Excuse me. So I spent a couple thousand minutes, it felt like, looking up, trying to discover the difference between visions and dreams. Now, we know what a dream is. It's obvious. A dream is something that you have as you're asleep. It's something that is in your mind. That's where the movie's being played, is in your mind. It's not in front of you. I used to think that the dreams were mirages or visual scenes that he could look at. But that's not what it says. It says that it was in his mind also. So I had to think about it for a second. And then I had to go back to Numbers chapter 12. So if you'll go back with me to Numbers chapter 12, you know it well. It's where Miriam had made her mistake. She had questioned Moses as regarding his not taking care of his wife the way he should. But I want you to look at verse number 6. So here in verse number 6 of Numbers, it begins by saying, mouth to mouth did I speak to him. That's Moses. It was in clear vision and no riddles. Clear vision. That doesn't mean he saw God, but the message was clear in his mind. So a vision is, again, something that's in one's mind. It's not something in front of them. It's not a mirage. You're not walking through it. It's deep within you. In fact, the rabbis call it the superconscious. A dream is found in your conscious level of your mind. Now, for us, conscious level goes back to how the day went, and maybe the dreams pour out of that. But in the case of a dream that's been given by God, it goes to that second level of consciousness. That's where the event actually takes place. And remember, many of those visions or many of those dreams, the men who had them couldn't interpret them. It was the Jewish men who could interpret them. And now here's Daniel. He's had a dream, singular, and he's had visions, plural. Singular, plural. If we go back to chapter 6 again, in the vision I shall make myself known to him. In a dream shall I speak with him. So a dream doesn't necessarily have to be anything visual. A dream can simply be him talking to your mind. That could be the dream. Not so my servant Moses. In my entire house, he is the trusted. Mouth to mouth, I spoke to him. So we go through this understanding that dreams and visions are something that's occurring within the mind of the person. In the case of a vision, it's at the highest level that God is now talking to them. That's really what's going on. In a dream, it was a conversation, I'm assuming, between the two. But now it's gone past that, and it's gone deep within him. And so it becomes very important to understand what's going on. Now, notice what it says is the vision was in his head upon his bed, or the visions were, and then wrote down the dream and told the major parts. Can you see the dream there? No, because the next verse is talking about a vision. So what was the dream that he had? Do you understand? What was the dream that he had? Rashi said, and I think it was Ibn Ezra who seconded it, that what we have here is not the complete Daniel 7. What we have here has been edited, and what we have, I would call no more than notes, which is why we are having such a struggle trying to understand all of the prophecy that's here, because it's not all here. He first has a dream to which he writes down the sum of the parts, but none of those parts are listed. And then we begin to have a vision after that. So was the dream simply a rerun? Was a vision simply a rerun of the dream? Or was there more to the story that we don't have that would be helpful to us as we go through our study? We also have to understand that visions are not exactly what you call clear. Now, the ones in the book of Genesis with the butler and all of those that are given by Joseph where he interprets, those are fairly plain. And I say fairly plain because it still requires some thinking. The visions that we're going to have here look like the visions. Turn back to Ezekiel chapter 1, because Ezekiel's living in this very same age. They're both having this visioning coming into their lives. And it's interesting to see what the vision is. Look at verse 4, chapter 1. Now, this is what we call the vision of the chariot. It begins by saying, and I saw, and behold, there was a stormy wind. Now, we're going to have winds in our story, coming from the north, only ours are going to come from all four directions. A great cloud with flashing fire and a brilliance surrounding it, and from the midst, like the color of hashmal, which is an amber color, in the midst of the fire. And in the midst, there was a likeness. And we're going to get likenesses over and over again in our stories. So it's not exactly the four Hayot, but it's like the four Hayot. This was their appearance. And he goes through a list of understandings of the appearances of this whole thing. Jump down to, let's see, how far? Down to verse 12. In the direction of each of his faces, they would go. Now there's a face going north, a face going south, a face going east, and a face going west. So are they all in charge? Which direction do they go? He goes on to say, as for the likeness of the Hayot, their appearance was like fiery coals, burning like the appearance of torches. Well, he just got through telling us one looks like a human, one looks like a lion, one looks like... Now all of a sudden they appear to be like torches. So are they glowing? Understand that this is a metaphor. That what we're looking at is not Ezekiel's spaceship. I remember, I don't know, several years ago, a NASA scientist said that, it was back in the days of going to the moon. He says the description here fits a lunar lander. Well, yeah, it may, but that's not what he's doing. What we're looking at here is actually him walking into prayer. Because as you go on, you find out the wheels of the chariot, the wheels are called Ophim. Well, Ophim is a level of angel. They're circular. That's what he's talking about. We have all different kinds of angels in this story in chapter 1. My point being that what we're looking at is like. Please understand it's like. So therefore, we're looking at a lot of different metaphors, and it becomes very difficult. And I think the reason it becomes more difficult is we don't know what was said in the dream, because he simply said he wrote it down, but then we begin talking about visions. So there's something that's been missing. Also, when we go back, if you go back to Daniel chapter 7, go back to that same verse. So he wrote down the dream and he told the major parts. Then he began and explained, I saw in my vision at night, that behold, the four winds of heaven, we saw it in Ezekiel, were stirring up the great sea. Okay, we're talking about like. So if we're talking about like, it's not necessarily that we're actually looking directly at night. It may not be night. It may be darkness, Hoshek. It may be Lila, but we don't know for sure, because a vision is a metaphor that's found deep within the brain. I spent the better part of 3 weeks getting ready for this lesson. One of those weeks I spent digging through my books on Kabbalah. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to understand what are the possibilities of each and every word. That becomes very tedious, especially when I'm doing other studies like Jeremiah or whatever have you. Very, very thought-provoking. But it's not an easy answer because it doesn't carry you right directly to what you want. You're only looking at things that have similarities in the beginning until you find the exact key word that you're looking for. So I want to look at night for a second, because night becomes a very significant part of this story. We begin by saying that in this particular point that it is dark, night. If we go back to the original darkness, we have to go all the way back to the book of Genesis, the first chapter. Do you remember how that first chapter started out? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and what? Darkness was on the face of the deep. Night. There was no light. There was no day. It was dark. Now, as we start to think about darkness, then we're going to have to understand, how do we normally categorize darkness? We speak of darkness as being that time when the thief is out. We speak of that as being a very treacherous time most often, because in darkness, evil flourishes. Remember that? So the question has to be then, are we looking at darkness? Are we looking at light? And immediately after that, the third verse says that God created light. So we have darkness and we have light. But we need both. In order for plants to grow healthy, we need both dark and we need both light. We need them both. And so we can't say that our story is going to tell us that we're looking at something that is basically evil, although there's a great deal of evil in it. But God, I think, wants us to look past some of that, because what we really need to focus on is religion, spirituality. We're given 3 animals and a thing. Now, these 3 animals, Daniel identifies as like a lion, like a bear, like a leopard. And then the fourth beast is undescribable. So we're looking at like. So darkness means that we need to turn on the lights. But before we do, we're going to find that there's 4 winds. So the next thing I had to look up was wind. But not just wind, I had to look up 4 winds. And why do I have to look up 4 winds? What am I really looking for? What am I trying to understand? Well, there's 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. That's an easy one. There's also 4 letters in God's name. Yud Kei Vav Kei. Is the wind talking to us about God? Again, it takes me back to spiritual things. God was walking Daniel through the minefield of spiritual events that are going to take place in the lives of the Jewish people. Now, remember, the Jewish people are going to be scattered all over the earth. They're going to be put in situations where these cultures, maybe not the animal itself, but these cultures will become very prevalent. And over the course of time, it will come to an end. Ketz. But as we're going through this, we have to understand that there's a lot of things that we really need to see that are not necessarily easy to find. Night can also speak of exile. The Jews were in exile now. Daniel understood that in 3 years or thereabouts, Judah will be going home. But not all Israel went home, and not all Judah left Babylon. If you go to the book of Ezra, you find out that only 58,000 Jews left captivity and went back to Jerusalem. 58,000. There were more than 1 million in Jerusalem when it started, but only 58,000 returned home. Why only 58,000? Well, Jeremiah said in the very beginning, he says, go to Babylon. You will find it's not that bad there. Well, it was in the first couple of years when they took it out on them and tormented them. But after that, Israel, Judah, they thrived in the environment that they found themselves in. Many of them became very wealthy. Many of them became scholars. Remember, the first Talmud was written in Babylon. First Talmud. And interesting enough, the first Talmud covers not only what happens in Jerusalem, but it happens across the world, all of the places that Israel will find itself in some way, shape, or form. So we begin to look at this whole thing, and I'm beginning to ask you to look at it differently. We're going to talk about the 4 beasts, or whatever you want to call them. And we're going to talk about, well, the end of this whole thing. And for that, I want to give you some understanding. The word that I'm going to use is because Daniel is being shown not only the present, but he's shown what it's going to be like in the end of days. This whole chapter is going to end up in the end of days. Now, the Hebrew word for end of days is ketz. Ketz is, well, let me give you this. I don't know if you can see it very well. I got 4 letters for you. Ketz is the word for end. The first letter is a kuf. Well, kuf is an interesting letter because the kuf is basically made up of 3 parts, but the 3 parts speak of evil. You see, the word ketz is the word that we're going to use when we talk about klipot, that which is unclean. I gave you the opposite of that. That's the letter hey. Hey is the word goes into the word hakadosh, the holiness. Unholiness, holiness. Both have 3 lines that form it. The top of the line is what is called our thought. The downstroke is what's called our speech. And the third line is called our actions. And in this case, this is the action for kuf. Understand, kuf goes below the line. The Jews understand by it going below the line that we're talking about going below God's standards, going towards evil. That's what's actually happening. Now, I gave you two other letters that look very much alike. One's called a resh. The other one's called a dalet. When you look at the letter resh, it's simply a curved line. But when you look at dalet, it has a figure to it and a little tip on the end. That tip becomes very, very important. The word resh gives us also the word ra, which is evil. If I put the letter kaf, kuf, and resh together, I have the word kar, which means cold, dead. When one leaves God, when he leaves holiness, he moves towards death. He moves towards coldness. On the other hand is dalet. Dalet has a little curl towards the top. Now, dalet usually means somebody who is poor. But this little line up here is called a yud. And the purpose of the yud is to tell you that even the poorest of the poor, you are in God's eye all the time. Difference in the way things are looked at. Both have three lines, but at the same point in time, they have different meanings altogether. So the idea of, the idea of Ketz is the fact of what it's going to be like at the end of days. And to get to the end of days, we're going to have three things that we're going to have to work through. One is night. The second is wind. And the third one is, do you see it? A great sea. A great sea. Well, when I was a Christian, a great sea just simply meant all the nations, the four beasts in Revelations, they rise up out of the sea, the great sea. Well, that's good if I was a Christian but you see, Daniel wasn't a Christian. So what does Daniel mean by the great sea? Another 2-day wander through the books, trying to come up with some really different understandings of what's going on. In the story of the sea, the spiritual level of most Kabbalists interpret the idea of the great sea as called the Sea of Wisdom. The Sea of Wisdom. My first effort in understanding Kabbalah was to buy a book that was way over my head. I'm sure none of you have ever done this. It's called Swimming Through the Sea of Talmud, in which I had 35 articles on different pages that are found in the Talmud. This isn't Kabbalistic. This is just what they normally understand and can read. But in order to pass understanding each and every page, you have to go through a process, and you end up testing out with your teacher. But this great sea is wisdom. In other words, you must go through darkness. You must go through this wind in order to reach an understanding, to reach the end. The great sea is also known as the 50 gates of understanding. That's another way that it can be looked at. Both of them should point you towards the Messiah. So as we're going through the great sea, we're pointing ourselves towards the Mashiach. We're coming to the end of days. So Daniel is now telling us right off the bat, this is what we're going to go through, and this is what we will see at the end of all of it. That's the story that we're going to look at this particular point in time. Now we're going to look at 3 of these today. It's already 7:30, so I've already talked to you for 30 minutes, even if you don't notice that. But I'm going to spend my time with the next 3 verses. Now, there are many things I can take you through, and depending on the time, I'm going to take you through some rather unusual stories that go along with this. But let's look at the first one. Verse number 3. 4 immense beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. Now notice this is not the Great Sea, this is just the sea. Again, in Hebrew, the sea is the Gentile world. Land is Israel. So coming up out of the Gentile lands, out of the sea, that's where Revelations might be right. We're going to find these 4 groups of people. Now, the first group, the first was like. Do you see that? Was like a lion. It had eagle's wings. I was watching as its wings were plucked and they were removed from the earth. And he stood up on 2 feet like a man, and it was given to him a human heart. Okay. A lion we know or recognize. Daniel would have seen lions all over Babylon. In fact, Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar had tremendous artisans in which what they call the main gate going into the city itself was, I can't even think what the main gate was called. But anyway, as you were going through the main gate, it was blue. And painted on it were all these different kinds of ferocious animals. None of them were a lion, none of them were a leopard, none of them were a bear, but different kinds of animals. And so throughout the city, I'm sure he saw many of these images that he's now using to talk to us. And the first image he's using is the lion, which we always associate with something that is ferocious. It's the king of the jungle. It's the king of the beast. That's where we start with it. But notice that this beast, this lion, was different. It had 2 wings. Lions don't have wings, so the wings have to tell us something else. Now, there are a couple of different ways that they've looked at these wings and come with different understandings. One of them that seems to be the most obvious is that the 2 wings represent 2 of the kings. Nebuchadnezzar was the lion, Evil-Merodach and Belshazzar were the other 2. They were the 2 wings. And notice what happens to the 2 wings. They are plucked from it. They die. So they're plucked from this. But notice the kind of wings that they were. They were eagle's wings. Remember, Babylon was the greatest of the empires, as we saw in the statue. So even in Belshazzar's weakness, he was still a great king. But as we're going through this now, we're watching him as he's plucked from the earth. These 2 wings came, and what happens? It stood on 2 feet. Well, that's an interesting thing. It stood on 2 feet like a man. So in other words, it goes from a ferocious animal to a human. Being human, notice what it says he has. A heart. A heart. In other words, there's kindness and love. Do you remember Nebuchadnezzar in the beginning? Every time he referred to Daniel, he called him Belshazzar. After the time that he was underneath the tree for all of that time, at that point, he didn't call him Belshazzar anymore. He began to call him Daniel. Because you see, Daniel had taken care of him during those entire months that he found himself out in the field. And so God, through Daniel, through Nebuchadnezzar, began to change his heart from being a ferocious lion to becoming that of a man. It's understood that Nebuchadnezzar actually did make it into the world to come, that he will survive. Not so said for evil Murdoch nor Belshazzar. Different. Look at the second beast for a second. Verse 5. Then behold another beast, a second one, similar to a bear, similar to a bear. It wasn't a bear. It was placed on one side, and there were 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And this is what they did, that they said to it, devour, arise, devour much flesh. Okay, so what are we looking at? It's like a bear, and it says there's about a second side. Similar to it, it was placed on one side. Actually, the wording or the language is it was tilted on one side, meaning one side was lower than the other. But remember, this empire didn't start out the Persian Empire. It started out the Media Persian Empire. How long did Media last? Less than a year. It was replaced. And so what we're watching then is we're watching this bear that is now becoming gluttonous. He is devouring. Some say that speaks to the bones in its mouth. Others say that that speaks to the 3 kings who made up the Persian Empire. Cyrus the Persian, Ahasuerus, who happened to be the wife of Esther, or the husband of Esther. And the third one was called Darius Ahasuerus, Esther's son. It was in Esther's son that the empire began to crumble because they ran into the Alexander's Greeks. That's when we began to see the wars going on in the Peloponnesian Wars and all that's going on. But anyway, back to the story. So we're looking at a bear who is very ferocious. And when we think of ferocious, we also think the fact that he's eating a lot. And so this bear was gobbling up countries. Others say that the 3 bones in its mouth were the 3 nations that it finally had to crush, because that's what a bear does. It crushes it because they continually rebelled. And that's what the 3 bones are. So the 3 bones can either be the 3 kings or it can be the nations that it was crushed. When it was all said and done, the Persian Empire stretched all the way from the Indus River, all the way through Turkey, all the way down into Egypt. All of that was territory that belonged to it. Now, the next portion says, after this, I was watching, and behold, another beast. This one was like a leopard, with 4 birds' wings on its back. Notice it's birds' wings, not eagles' wings. So what we're looking at is not exactly the same kind of feathers or wings. So I had 4 birds' wings on his back. And by the way, if you want, the word for birds here is oaf. Oaf is a chicken. So it had 4 chicken wings on its back. He must have gone to Kentucky. Never mind. Back to the story. The beast had 4 heads, and it was given dominion. Well, this one seems to be the most logical one. There's less fighting over what he's actually saying here. But as we're looking at this 4th beast, one of the things that we're going to begin to notice is the fact that this beast is going to have a leopard. Well, then it's going to have spots. So the question then becomes, well, what are the spots on the back of the leopard all about? Why, it wasn't mentioned. Maybe that's why it's only called like a leopard, because there were no spots. Many people have looked at that and said that those spots are going to represent something entirely different, that they're going to represent evil things that they did to the Jewish people. Among them was the attempted extermination of them. But I've digressed. I've gone too fast. Now, these 3 nations, I want you to skip down to verse number 12 for a second. We're going to skip the 4th beast, and like I said, that will be next week's teaching. But verse 12, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, yet the extension of life was given to them until the season and time. That's the end of days. So these three beasts that we're looking at are going to have their kingdoms. They'll run through their lifespans, and they will be there until the end. Now, I want to go back a second, and I want you to understand something spiritual about each of these nations, because that becomes important. If we begin with the Babylonians, what we're looking at spiritually is the purest form of idolatry. Babylonian religion was all about idolatry. After the Babylonian exile ends, Israel, the rabbis will have finally convinced the people that idolatry is no longer acceptable. And you'll find that idolatry will die out, that they will substitute it with something else, which was probably far worse at times. Idolatry, I don't know if you know this, idolatry began with the man called Enosh. Do you know who Enosh is? He was the grandson of Adam. Enosh was a good man, but by this time the world is becoming very populated. It's also become several hundred years away from when Adam first came on this earth. And so there were lots of people that have been born who really never knew God. Because remember, in the very beginning, God hid himself. He wasn't easy to find. He's in nature, but you had to go looking for him. And that was a problem. And so they began to think about other things. And so they began to look to the sky. And they began to look at the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets. And they said something like the Catholics. You see, they were treated like saints. I remember going to a wedding, friends of mine can tell you, it was a Catholic wedding. And that ceremony was going on, and all of a sudden, the bride and the groom left the podium, and they walked over to the side of the church, and I was thinking, what in the world's going on? Well, they went over to the statue of Mary, and they prayed to Mary to have her intervene for them with God. That's what began to happen in the days of Enosh. They began to find a substitute. I can't go to God because I don't know who he is, but I can see the stars. I can see the planets. I know where to go now. And so they began to go to them. Did you know that the Great Flood was not the first flood? Did you know that? The first flood actually came during the days of Enosh. Because you see, idolatry was getting out of hand. Not only was it the sun and moon and the stars, but they were now worshiping animals, and they were now worshiping plants, and they were worshiping everything. And so the first flood crossed a third of the earth off. And that was in the days of Enosh. That's why when Babel was created, Nimrod says we're never going to be destroyed by water again. He wasn't talking about just the Great Flood. He was talking about two floods. And you know what? Nebuchadnezzar, or Nimrod, was living in the days when the third flood should have happened. And so they began to build themselves a tower. It becomes rather interesting when you begin to look at this whole story. So the first empire talks to us about the religion of idolatry. The second empire has a different religion. Theirs is far more subtle. I don't know how many of you understand the word Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism. It's a religion that started in Persia. Zoroaster was a priest. He had just come from the temple and was now washing himself in a river. And while he was in the river washing himself, according to the stories, while he's washing himself in the river, yeah, here, let me get to the right page. He began to have a vision. Sound familiar? He began to have a vision while he was bathing. And he was bathing because he was trying to purify himself. And along came Vohu Mana. Vohu Mana. The good mind. The good mind. Now, the good mind began to talk with Zoroaster, and they began to have a conversation about God. And he says, well, I can take you to him. You can? Well, yes, of course. It's easy. Follow me. And so he follows him, and he meets for the very first time the God that's called Aharu. Aharu. Now, Aharu was a god of the lords, the kingly god. He also had 5 other nobles with him that were called the Immortals. The Immortals. I don't know if you ever read the story of the 500, the Spartans, the 500 that stood in the valley of Thermopolis and fought against the Immortals. The Immortals were those people that were holy immortals. In other words, they could not die, although they did. And he began to go to Aharu, and he began to develop what's called a religion, an understanding that he began to teach to the rest of the people in Persia. Now, when he starts teaching to the people in Persia, he actually finally finds somebody in the royalty who accepted him and what he was teaching. His name was Cyrus the Persian. So Cyrus the Persian converted to Zoroastrianism. Now, there's a lot of things about it. It's what they call a cosmic dual religion. In other words, there's such a thing as day and night, life and death. Oh, you've read Ecclesiastes 4, right? To everything there is a season, a time, and all. Well, guess what? That happens to be just exactly what we're talking about, cosmic dualism. Now, in the process of teaching that, they ran into a character called Agranu Mayunu, the destructive spirit. He wasn't God, but he was pure evil. He was pure energy. And he would attack people. He would attack them with death. He would attack them with famine. He would attack them with sicknesses. He would attack them with disasters of all kinds. Aharu lived in heaven. Angra lived in hell. Did you hear that? Heaven and hell. Christianity hasn't even been created yet. Heaven and hell was already created. Those terms. Now, as we begin to look at these characters, then we're looking at a religion that is beginning to what? Model itself after Judaism. And you hear the things that are very Jewish in it. The Ecclesiastes 4, the understanding of good and evil, the understanding of all of those things that we need to concentrate on it in our walk with God. Agrana was the one who created death, the separation. So the second religion was a religion that's modeled after, looks like. Now, the third one was a leopard. Well, what difference could that be? But if you know what a leopard is, you know that a leopard deals with the idea of Greece. What do we know about the Greek religion? Well, they started out idolatrous, but they didn't stay that way. No, their religion became science and mathematics and philosophy. That became their religion. They moved into the real world. so to speak, as we go through it. In the Hellenistic times, when Alexander the Great was around in the very beginning of the four breaks in the kingdom, wealth was very common, even for those who were not Greek. Wealth produces extravagance. Extravagance produces, well, personal pleasure. What do we know about the Greek culture? Well, the Greek culture is based upon just that. It's based upon pleasure. We go back and we can look and we begin to see, for example, that Greece was never intending to disband Judaism. They were encouraging them to become a part of their way, to assimilate. That's what was going on, assimilation. So we have a religion of idolatry. We have a religion that's based upon a similarity to Judaism. And now we have a religion based upon humanness, in which we can all be a part. That's what the religions were bringing. That's what Daniel was saying when you had to go through darkness, night. That's what you were looking at. Now, it said in that 12th verse, it said the fact that these nations would be around to the end. And we know that the first nation is Babylon. Well, today, Babylon doesn't exist as Babylon. Babylon exists as Iraq. One of the things that we know about Iraq was Saddam Hussein, because you see, that was the last great king over that nation, only he didn't call himself a king. He spent billions of dollars while he's at war with Iran, building or rebuilding the real city of Babylon. He was going to rebuild the Tower of Babel. Every brick that was used there, because you remember, there are no rocks in Iran or Iraq, only sand. Everything was kiln. So every brick that was used to put together the walls of the city and the buildings, every brick had on one side an engraving of Nebuchadnezzar. On the other side was the engraving of the picture of Saddam Hussein. And he was building that city. Well, it's still there somewhat, but it's not thanks to George Bush or to George Bush II, because that's when we begin to see what's became a tremendous war. First, it started out as Desert Shield, where they took back from the Iraqis, they took back Kuwait, which they called the 13th state. At the same time, the second one was started by his son, George Bush II. Do you want to know the interesting story? The interesting story is the day that both battles started. Purim. Both Desert Storm and Desert Shield started on Purim. Well, that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that once they defeated Saddam, Bill Clinton came to office. Bill Clinton was still worried about Iraq, so he organized a blockade. So the people of Iraq became poorer and poorer, and they began to starve themselves to death. Basically, Bill Clinton destroyed the economy of Iraq. Now, after this whole thing is done, he appoints a man named Paul Bremer. Paul Bremer decided that besides that, I still worry about their army. So Paul Bremer dissolved the entire army of Iraq. If you have a country that has no army and no technical leader, what do you have? Well, you have Iraq, where they have 5 major tribes. Iraq today is broken down into tribal conflicts, back and forth all over. It's all about this whole thing. Now, Obama supplied some money so they could build a military again, but it was too late because the military began to steal the money. And if they didn't steal it, somebody else did. But all in all, I keep coming back to Daniel chapter 7, verse 12. They're still here, but they're not what they were. Oh, yeah, Persia's here. That's obvious. But, well, it's 8 o'clock, so let's stop. And I'll talk to you about Persia next time and talk to you about the fourth of the nations. I gave you a lot of stuff. I don't know if you have any questions or thoughts that you want to add. I hear silence. Crickets, I believe, is what Dana Perino calls it. No? Well, I appreciate y'all being here. Hope you come back for part 2. It'll be the longer part, but hopefully it'll be interesting. Give you something else to think about, and we'll go back. And I want to also talk to you about Daniel chapter 7. Not only deals with ancient empires, but Daniel chapter 7 deals with modern day empires. And that's another part to this whole story. So until next time, Shalom, Laila Tov.